Ahoy! I already showed you some of the unannounced changes on the PTR yesterday, but there are many more, and today I want to dig into some more of them, especially information about the next weapon. It appears that just a little bit of info has bled through with some data mining, but that's enough to tell us a lot. In my opinion, this actually solidifies and pretty much confirms what the next weapon will be, to the extent that any data mining can be seen as a confirmation. The devs already confirmed that the next weapon will be focused on healing, buffing, and supporting, so that's what we knew so far, and the first speculation went towards the Celestial Gauntlet or the Mace primarily. However, we got the information that there is a Flail in the file somewhere as well that looked like it was a more recent addition, and I figured that seems like a more likely case because it's kind of similar to a Mace, maybe like a bit of an upgrade to a Mace. And it also was a more similar data mining, whereas the other information about the older weapons was from way back in the day. And now we have some brand new data mining, which is under player one-handed melee. So this is a file where player animations are stored for the different attacks with the different weapons that you can do as a player. And I think the indicator that this is specifically for the player as well is also a very strong one. One of the nodes that we can find here is set switch vocals fall flail. But more importantly, we can find various animations for different offhand conditions. We can find tower shield fall flail loop, shield fall flail loop, and unarmed fall flail loop. Of course, this was one of the things many of us speculated about, that potentially a flail or a mace could be ran with an offhand shield, but having these multiple mentions of the shield here, and then the also specific mention of unarmed when you're not using a shield, basically confirms it for me. This is super exciting news, so we will finally have a second weapon that can be utilized with a shield. Now I will say there is another node here as well that I can't really place. There is an RSWRD fall flail loop. This pretty much spells out sword to me. I don't know what the R in front of it stands for, so maybe it's right sword or something. So maybe there is even a potential for dual wield here. But I don't want to lean out of the window too much with that one because I don't really know how that would work with the current systems. So with a flail working with a shield, it means that the devs were pretty serious when they were talking about a weapon that is there for supporting as well. Since they also said it's used for healing and buffing, this is really going to be a true paladin weapon. I recall them saying at some point in the past that to them a new weapon is essentially like a new class, and this makes a lot of sense here. The weapon here is basically introducing paladins into the game. Obviously, there were people trying to do paladin builds before, but they were never particularly synergistic compared to what we'll likely have here with a weapon that will probably scale with focus to some degree. Now, a big question mark for me is why the unarmed version and the R-sword version exist. So the unarmed version makes sense so far that even with a sword you can run it without a shield, so you can always run an unarmed option if you want to. But as most of you who ever used the sword and shield know, it's not very beneficial to run the sword without the shield because you're losing so many attribute perks that it's effectively not worth it, even though it would allow you to get some better armor in return. So there is a good chance that this will also be true for the mace, but maybe not. Maybe they want you to be able to choose between being a more healing focused player with this and using it without a shield, or being a more self-sufficient player and using it with a shield. We don't know for sure, but it could be interesting. Of course, you could also run a round shield in light and just not have a chest piece, and that would still work out the same way. So I'm curious if there is going to be any effectiveness to that. And of course, there is the potential that there's possibly dual wield with this with a sword, but I am very skeptical despite the mention here, just because it doesn't really sound like something you would do with a healing, buffing, and supporting weapon. That would be a weird first choice for a proper dual wield weapon. But the information we're getting doesn't end there, and there is even more info that confirms the flail. If we look at another piece of the data mining, we can see the backstory JSON, and there's a flail playtest backstory, which effectively is something that refers to PTR usually, or some other earlier test version, where you have those player backstories which allow you to test out specific things. So for example, for the current patch, there'll probably be a sandworm backstory or something like that. And there's a specific backstory for the flail. So once again, a very strong indicator this will be the next weapon, because otherwise, why would they set up a specific test only for this weapon and not for the other ones that we talked about previously? This also says release version weapon flail, and then there's a reference to the greatsword, which was the last weapon that was released beforehand, along with a flail ability table. There's also a flail tier 5 600, which very likely refers to 600 gear score. What is of course extremely interesting is how the different shield weights will interact here. Now a light shield would obviously make sense if you want to get the maximum amount of healing, because you get the highest amount of healing in light, and the heavier you go, the less healing you get effectively. But on the other hand, if the weapon is more focused on maybe passive healing, percentage healing, buffing and stuff like that, it may not be that relevant compared to, say, a life staff. So maybe you can be effective going into heavy and going with a tower shield and just being this very bulky character that also has some self-heal and mainly focuses on buffing their allies. What I would be particularly curious to see is the middle ground, a medium healer, potentially with a kite shield. I believe that if they're introducing a new class using shields, then this may be the moment where they're actually overhauling shields a little bit. At least that is my hope. Because at the moment, most of you know, medium shields are not very effective for anything. Kite shields are just not good. If you're running a medium loadout with a shield, you're still going to run a round shield to have the lowest armor loss possible, essentially. Because the block stability is usually not enough to offset it since you're dodging so much in medium. But it is worth keeping in mind that different shield weights have different perk pools. So, say for example, maybe Blessed will be added to shields, but you can only get it on kite shields, then suddenly kite shields could be a whole lot more interesting if you don't want to have Blessed on your weapon. We'll have to see how that plays out, if that is the case, but there are definitely possible reasons how they could introduce kite shields in a way that they're actually useful. I do hope that in the context of that, they also do a balance pass on shields. Either adjust the armor values so they actually scale properly with the weight like any other armor, or if they want to go the other way around, just remove the armor value entirely, remove the weight, and you can just use a shield in your normal loadouts. I would prefer that one, so your offhand is less hindered by using a shield. And speaking of offhands, that is obviously also a very interesting conversation to have. Now, of course, you could very simply go with a life staff and just have a double healer buffer build, and that is probably something that some people will do, similar to some people running a Void Gauntlet with a focus on healing. But I think that's probably not the only option, and maybe not even the best one. With this weapon apparently being designed to be at least somewhat in the middle of things, considering you're using a shield with it, and being a melee weapon, I suspect that a lot of the abilities may also be more close range focused. For example, you may remember the projectile block shield that used to be on the Celestial Gauntlet. I'm not exactly sure if that would make it into the game right now, considering we just got a new way of blocking projectiles, but I do think that something like that would be much more effective on a player that can go into the middle of things and drop a dome around his allies that protect them in some ways. Think something similar to Oblivion or Voidcaller that gets casted around you, but instead of hurting or debuffing the enemy, it is buffing and supporting your allies somehow. And if these buffs are good enough, then I would expect the weapon to become a staple in wars, much like Void Gauntlets and Life Staffs already are. But if you have to be in the middle of things, then you will probably choose another offhand. You could, for example, obviously go for a sword and shield, because you already have that shield equipped anyways, but that may also be overkill. That may be like running a sword and shield with a greatsword for tanking, which is very much possible, don't get me wrong, but it's a situation where enemies can often walk away from you fairly easily, and you can't really punish them that much because you're just super tanky and you don't have that much hard CC, for example. And I don't know if this weapon will be heavy on the hard CC side. So if you, for example, paired it with a hammer, then you'd have the CC from the hammer and the quick self-peel with that and a decent amount of damage still from that, whereas you could then switch over to the flail and block better with that and self-buff yourself and your allies. So could be an interesting mix. On the other hand, at least so far, our support weapons are not exactly known for their mobility, Void Slide excluded, and as such you may also require an offhand with mobility instead. But maybe this also ends up going in a completely different direction where you're just medium and self-buffing, self-healing, and then be an absolute nuisance with a greatsword. Whatever it turns out to be, I'm very excited for the potential to have another weapon with a shield. I personally very much liked a debuffer playstyle in Wars, and I do like running shield builds, so combining that and maybe running a buffer playstyle instead that can also go a bit more aggressive with the other weapon would be extremely interesting and exciting to me. We still don't know more about is the damage type. Strike seems like the obvious choice for a flail, but also somebody pointed out to me that the flail could have spikes at the end, so maybe it could do partial slash or thrust damage that is coming from these spikes, and also the weapon could be enchanted. It could maybe not deal any physical damage at all and just deal any magical damage type. I'm thinking that if it's enchanted, it will probably have a new damage type that is currently unused by other weapons in order to set itself apart more, so the likely options to me are Arcane or Lightning. I'm leaning a bit more towards Arcane because Arcane was already used by the original Celestial Gauntlet, so it would be a kind of a throwback there. And also lightning feels like a fantastic fit for a mage weapon like a lightning staff, so I don't know if they want to take away from that by introducing a weapon with lightning damage before that. This is probably as much information as we get about the new weapon before the next round of the PTR for the next patch for the expansion, unless Amazon decides that they want to announce something at any of the events that are coming up when it comes to the expansion, if they want to make a big trailer and maybe talk about the weapon there. We'll see about that. As soon as we know more, I will let you know, so hit that little red button if you want to get updated. In the next days we have plenty more secrets from the PTR to talk about, and also some Diablo tips and tricks, and I'll also be streaming on Twitch, link is in the description. If you'd like to support me further, you can do that on Patreon, where I post early trading tips. Thanks to all my patrons who do exactly that, and thank you for watching. Sloth, out.